Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Wendy Walker. I'm a VP of Regulatory Affairs at Sovos. I'm here with John Kreger. He's our VP of Product Management at Sovos. Today, we are going to dive into a topic that is top of mind for many organizations right now, which is how the 1099 filing landscape is evolving, and specifically what the IRS's new IRIS system means for your compliance strategy. Over the past few years, we've seen a clear shift towards digital-first reporting, and the IRIS system is really a big part of that change. But as with any new system, it does raise some important questions to consider. First, what is IRIS really designed to do? And where does it work well and where does it fall short? And how should organizations be thinking about their processes moving forward? That's what we're going to unpack today. So let me set the stage. IRS modernization, it's not just a general move toward digital-first reporting. More specifically, the IRIS system replaces core parts of the FIRE model, filing information returns electronically. The FIRE model used fixed-width ASC2 flat files, and those are now going to be replaced with structured XML schemas. We use a batch file upload process with FIRE, and that's being replaced with an API-based transmission process. And we use post-filing batch error notices, things like CP2100B notices, 972CG notices. Those notices, while we'll still receive them, we're also going to receive real-time validations as we're filing an IRIS. And with that, very detailed error responses. Just so you know, IRIS was required legislatively. It was required by the Taxpayer First Act of 2019. So this wasn't just a discretionary IRS initiative to build a new system. It is a legislative mandate, and the shift moving to the IRIS system is an irreversible one. FIRE is going to be retired. It has now been officially announced that tax year 2025, that we filed just earlier in 2026, is the last filing system that will be supported in the FIRE system. FIRE will fully retire this year as of December 31st, 2026.
Yeah, the scale behind this transition is really significant. By the 2024 filing season, the IRS was receiving more than 5 billion information returns every year through the FIRE system. And those total volumes are expected to far exceed that as we look at the new reporting regimes coming online in 2025 and beyond. Growth is really accelerating due to new reporting regimes, including 1099-DA digital asset reporting, and then all of the new form types that are being released as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act from this past year. FIRE was built for a mainframe filing environment. It was really not designed to support the volume that it's seeing today. With today's security, validation, and real-time processing expectations. IRIS is also a part of a much broader IRS decommissioning and consolidation plan, their information reporting modernization plan. FIRE is the immediate focus. It's what the IRS is pushing forward right now, but we do expect to see other ancillary information reporting systems like AIR for ACA reporting and the IDES system, which was used for FATCA filers, to be replaced with IRIS over the coming filing seasons.
Yeah, and this isn't an isolated 1099 system change, as you heard John mention, right? It is the beginning of a broader shift in how information reporting is going to work as a whole across the IRS. And so, organizations really need to think beyond simply replacing one filing tool with another, new system. Readiness in this new environment with the IRS depends on clean upstream data, validated name and TIN combinations, integrated systems, and the ability to respond to real-time IRS validation feedback.
a key point here is filing is no longer the end of the process for many businesses. Filing is the result of everything that you and your tax operations team are doing upstream to prepare for an ongoing reporting process. Organizations that are best positioned for IRIS are going to be the ones that treat compliance as an ongoing data and workflow discipline, not a once-a-year filing event.
So John, let's talk a little bit about what IRIS is and what it isn't, right? IRIS, if we didn't say it already, Information Return Intake System. It is the IRS provided e-filing platform for information returns. But IRIS isn't a single operating model, right? It has two different modes to it. There is the IRIS taxpayer portal, which includes manual entry and a CSV upload feature. And then there's the IRIS application to application, or A to A API. The taxpayer portal, it's designed for smaller filers, simple use cases. CSV upload through the portal is capped currently at 250 records. But the A to A, on the other hand, is designed for high volume, automated system to system bulk filing. So the issue, isn't that IRIS can't support volumes at scale, right? The issue is that implementing IRIS A to A at scale in your organization is significantly more complex than I think many people expect it to be.
Yeah, that distinction is really important. IRIS does provide meaningful improvements over the FIRE system that we're all used to. For example, the instant name and TIN feedback is a game changer compared to what we saw with FIRE. You're getting immediate submission confirmation, whereas with FIRE, you had to wait 5 to 10 days to see whether the IRS gave you a good or bad response. There's also direct correction linking. You've got record IDs that help you identify specific records that you need to, when you get errors and you need to make updates to. And there's also real-time validation instead of the post-filing batch error notices, which is a huge improvement over the legacy Fireside. So those are real benefits, especially when we compare them with the batch processing model we're all used to. But those benefits come with a very different implementation burden. The XML is much more complicated than the 1220 filing format was historically. Before an organization can even begin testing the XML, there's onboarding steps that they have to go through. You have to sign up for and get officers from your company to register as part of the IRS e-services system. You have to have background checks and potentially fingerprinting if you don't have a CPA or attorney serving as your responsible official. Those steps alone can take weeks to a month or more, depending on how people can fit those into their schedules. Then you have to apply for an IRIS-specific TCC. FIRE TCCs are not valid in the IRIS system, which that TCC application process, once it's submitted, can take the IRS another 45 days to process. So, to differentiate IRIS TCCs from FIRE TCCs, IRIS TCCs now start with a D. So it's pretty easy to know if the TCC that your organization currently has possession of is going to work with the FIRE or the IRIS system going forward. Only after you've completed all those steps, you actually get access to the IRIS schema package that allows you to build out the filings that you need to out of your system. So there is a barrier just to getting to that process of onboarding.
And I think John's being nice when he says, it might take a month or more with that background check. We had to go through, one of our members had to go through that fingerprinting process. And I think it actually required physical fingerprinting that had to be mailed into the IRS. So it actually took, I think, several months for us. So it really does depend on the people you have that are going to be registering, and then, the IRS's backlog or their process for getting you through. I think even after you initially onboard, though, this isn't just a one-time setup, right? IRIS is going to actually require annual recertification by the IRS for you to be able to actually file in production. And that annual recertification is required form by form. So every return type that an organization issues has to be separately tested and approved. And filing eligibility has to be maintained every year. And that's going to create an ongoing compliance and technology obligation for your organization, not just a one-time migration project.
Yeah, there's also a major security model change that I think most businesses need to understand. Under IRIS, the IRS is not only validating whether a file matches the schema, the XML schema, it's also validating who generated that file and who transmitted it using digital signing certificates. Those signing certificates need to match the TCC of the software that was used to generate the file. So that means you can't simply take a file generated by a third-party system and pass it through an approved application or A-to-A connection. The details need to be in the file at the time of generation. Generation, validation, and transmission really do need to happen within the same certified environment. And it's a meaningful change from how many vendor-assisted filing models worked in the past. It can really break existing processes if organizations assume that IRIS is just a new file format. It's a very different filing method entirely.
That's it, John, right? Like that is unfortunately like one of the assumptions we're definitely seeing is that people are assuming it's just a new file format. So the takeaway from this is that IRIS is definitely more capable of a system than people realize. It's not just a small filer portal anymore. The A-to-A model is specifically designed for high volume automated filing, for larger companies. But the complexity is in the implementation of this system. Organizations need to be ready for that e-services registration, applying for and receiving your IRIS-specific transmitter control code, security onboarding and obtaining those signing certificates that John talked about, annual testing and approval to file, form by form testing, and then, of course, a certified environment that controls, as John said, the generation, the validation, and the transmission of the XML.
Yeah, that's really why IRIS should not just be treated as a simple replacement for FHIR. It's a much more modern filing platform. It solves some real problems, but it also changes all of the technical, operational, and security expectations around information reporting. All right. Well, we've talked quite a bit about the background and how the new IRIS platform is different. Let's talk a little bit about where organizations really do run into challenges trying to adopt IRIS. One of the biggest challenges with IRIS is that it changes the operating model for compliance. Under FHIR, a lot of organizations treated information reporting as a once-a-year batch exercise. They gathered their data, created a file, they submitted it, and they then dealt with the errors or notices after the fact, sometimes months or even years after the fact. With IRIS, that model changes entirely. Errors that used to surface later through those notices and through downstream file rejections now surface instantly during the submission process. There's much more robust validation errors in the IRIS system than there was in FHIR. That means that teams have to resolve issues within the filing window, not weeks or months later, near real time. You really do need to have a process in place to turn those things around. And the workload shifts from postseason cleanup to in-cycle issue management. I have a big example of this from this past tax season was a large client of ours who for years had been filing to the IRS using the wrong EIN and name combination on their payer record. They'd never received errors from the FHIR system or the IRS before related to their payer information. But in IRIS, an EIN and name mismatch on the payer record causes a full submission rejection. This is very different from how FHIR handled this in the past. It's a much bigger operating model change than simply moving from one filing system to another.
And that shift, it really puts a lot more pressure on the data and the workflows that are happening, throughout the year and upstream behind the filing. IRIS doesn't solve your upstream data problems, right? Instead, what you're going to find is it's going to expose things you didn't even know were issues it will expose, or it's going to expose things are an issue much earlier in the process. Some of the things that we are seeing in this are, for example, incomplete vendor or payee data, missing or incorrect TINs frankly, those items, the TIN name combinations this year, we saw with our clients, 25% of the errors that we saw in production were related to those name TIN mismatches. Names that aren't structured correctly, data that comes from multiple source systems, and then teams that are trying to clean up issues at the last minute. These are all challenges that we've seen folks dealing with as they've transitioned over to Iris. In a real-time validation environment, those issues become filing blockers for you. And so if you're used to this, file now and fix later process, you're going to need to rethink how you do the information reporting process every year.
There's also new technical and operational challenges that are going to impact large filers. For example, the Iris system, the API integration, has a 100 megabyte uncompressed payload file limit. That means large filings may need to be split into multiple separate files. Each file that you submit generates its own submission ID and receipt ID information. And then organizations have to track and reconcile those IDs down the line. You need those for your corrections. You have to link corrections back to the right submission using the submission ID and the unique record ID. So a lot more to track than in the historic filing process, which is really a meaningful increase in complexity, right? It doesn't really have an equivalent under FHIR. This is all new complexity that we've never dealt with before.
Yep. And that correction handling is an area where you might need to retrain folks, right? Because those targeted record level corrections that John's mentioning, that's going to replace, the whole old full file resubmission kind of mindset that was out there. Corrections need to be linked to those prior submission IDs and record IDs. So you'll need a clear reconciliation process year over year, between those IDs and those record IDs versus, your source systems. And you also need to be aware, when those response files come back from the IRS, right? Which records were accepted with errors, rejected, which ones were corrected later on, and also which submission each correction belongs to, right? Because you'll have confirmation numbers for each of those submissions. So all of those different variations require new workflows, especially for teams that have been, operating under this FHIR model for many, many years.
State filing is also another major friction point. The IRIS transition has really disrupted the combined federal state filing process program or CFSF. For the 2025 filing season, fewer than 5 states had converted over to the new IRIS format, which really meant that many organizations now have to produce 2 separate or even more file formats. You've got the IRIS XML for the federal filing, but then you have a legacy 1220 or a state-specific format for most state filings. And we expect this, just to continue an ongoing pattern of state direct filing requirements. In some cases, states required paper, CSV, secure file transfer, or PDF files for the returns that the IRS now accepts only through the IRIS platform. So, some examples like the 1099 DA and some 1099 NEC reporting scenarios, such as golden parachute payments, those really were only allowed by the IRS this tax season through IRIS. So the states didn't have a good way to capture that information reporting at this point, and we expect to see those regimes expand in the year ahead.
I think another thing I'm seeing in that state reporting landscape that's sort of another twist here is that people are saying, well, is it 1220 or is it IRIS? And I think you need to actually be asking, is it IRIS XML or is it IRIS CSV, right? Because I think we have some states that are actually saying, yep, we accept IRIS, but they're not accepting the XML, they're accepting the CSV format. So I think it's going to get a little bit more nuanced here over the next couple of years. But just broadly, the combined federal state filing program, you should never treat that as a complete state filing strategy anyway. I mean, it obviously can help in some cases, but there are many, many nuances in that program that can leave you with the requirement to go and file directly with the state. So for example, some states that are listed in the IRS's publication as participating in the program, they still require you to take your files over and directly submit in the portal. One example, Maryland. Combined federal state doesn't support all of the 41 different information return types that are required by the IRS. For example, the 5498. So there are some form types that you're required to issue to the IRS that you will have to file directly because the combined fed state program doesn't support those. And the combined federal state filing program routing that the IRS does is completely based on the payee address on the form, which can miss situations where more than one state has a reporting jurisdiction on a single return. For example, if a payee lives in Pennsylvania, but they perform services in New Jersey, the combined fed state program would route the 1099 record to Pennsylvania based on the payee address. However, New Jersey would also require a copy of that 1099. And that creates a real legal exposure at the state level for organizations if they just assume that the combined federal state program is going to cover all of their state obligations.
Another big challenge we see is really cross-functional dependency within organizations. IRIS is not just a tax project, right? It touches tax, IT, security, data governance, operations teams. Each of those teams has a role in the implementation. For example, tax is rarely responsible for capturing vendor information or client information during the onboarding process. They're just a downstream consumer of that data. So if IT is still mapping XML requirements, tax may not be able to validate forms in time for transmission. If data governance hasn't resolved source system inconsistencies or name formatting in source systems, operations might be cleaning up errors right into the filing window. And if any one team slips, the entire filing season can be at risk.
Yep. And it's why organizations we are finding are underestimating the timeline of this implementation project, because the filing itself, it's the visible step, but the real work with this transition is everything that has to happen before you actually file. The data cleanup, TIN validation, system integration, security onboarding, state filing preparation, correction workflows, and the cross-functional coordination that John talked about.
Yeah, the main point here is the IRIS does not change how organizations submit files. It changes how they manage their entire compliance operation. Teams need to be ready to manage the issues that pop up from IRIS in real time across multiple submissions, across federal and state requirements, and across departments. And that is where many organizations are going to run into trouble trying to implement this on their own.
Yeah, we keep talking about the data validations and kind of making sure, that data quality upstream. Let's talk a little bit about the growing importance of data accuracy and TIN matching, because under IRIS, the validations, as we were saying, they move earlier in the filing process. Under FIRE, many organizations were able to operate with, this file and fix it later mindset. Errors would just surface, weeks or months later through, those post-filing notices. With IRIS, that buffer, it starts to disappear. Your records can fail on intake, and your bad data can become an immediate filing issue right there in January, and not something that's a post-season cleanup item.
Yeah. One of the biggest examples is individual payee name formatting. So under IRIS, individual payee names need to be separated into structured fields, right? You have a first name, middle name, last name, and a suffix field, all separate. That might sound like a simple data mapping exercise, but it's totally different from how the FIRE system required this information historically. And it's a penalty risk. 25% of our clients filing through IRIS this tax season had TIN name validation errors, which is a big surprise to many of them who never saw these errors until, potentially months or years later. Many of the source systems store a single name field for recipients, and they've been doing this for decades. So if organizations are restructuring that data, adding new fields to track that upstream, they can actually artificially create large volumes of name TIN mismatches themselves. And those TIN those TIN name mismatches can trigger CP 2100 backup withholding notices. So it's important to get ahead of those. We do have to, filers do have to send specific notices out to their payees. They have to request updated W-9s to get updated information, and then potentially have to begin backup withholding at 24% on all their future payments.
Yeah, and the risk actually doesn't stop there, because if the same incorrect data continues to be filed, right, year over year, then that population can become the basis for their penalties under the Notice 972CG, under 6721 and 6722 of the code. So, a simple basic data mapping decision can turn into very significant penalty exposure very quickly. And for large filers, that exposure can easily reach seven figures per calendar year. Proactive TIN validation is going to help prevent those problems before filing even begins.
IRS also exposes some upstream data quality problems that older fixed width formats could sometimes absorb. The data problem isn't new. IRS just makes it much harder to ignore because of the structured XML fields. They surface the inconsistencies in source systems. So if you have names stored in the wrong format, missing or combined name components, address elements that are incomplete or inconsistent, zip codes that don't follow standard patterns, lots of trailing or leading zeros that get added onto zip codes. We've all seen that in data. And then TINs that haven't been validated against IRS records. Under FIRE, some of those issues may not have caused any visible filing problems, but under IRS, they're immediate rejection or validation issues that you have to deal with.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll expand a little. We keep saying that under FIRE, some of those things may not have been visible. And it isn't just, we keep talking about these notices. And I think some filers would say, well, I don't get notices. I haven't seen those. And that's because the IRS only issues notices to filers who hit a certain threshold of errors. And so I think one of the things that, we noticed at Sovos for many of our clients was, as John said before, they were receiving mismatches for things they had never seen before. And that's because they never hit those thresholds to receive some of those after the fact notices that FIRE would issue. But now with IRS, there are no thresholds. It doesn't matter if it's one record or a million records. You're going to receive name TIN mismatches. So again, these are immediate, much more apparent validation issues. And I think that shift to real-time validation will also change the role of the TIN matching system, right? TIN matching, it's no longer going to be like a best practice that you do before filing system. I think it really does need to become a core part of being ready to transition to the IRS system because of what John talked about, that change in the name TIN fields, and then that feedback that you're receiving from the IRS system right at time of filing. Your bad TIN data isn't going to wait for a B notice cycle or a penalty notice. It's going, it can fail immediately or be accepted with errors, meaning the IRS is expecting you to correct it. And similarly, they expect you to correct it oftentimes during the filing window, during a 60-day period after you filed. So that's creating deadline pressure for you, operational stress, risk in a timeline that you did not have previously.
Yeah, the better approach is really to validate TIN name information earlier and continuously. So validating TINs and names at onboarding, when any of your vendor or payee records change. Every year, many of our clients validate before filing season. We consider that a best practice to do an annual bulk TIN match. Then throughout the filing year. So anytime that you have underlying information changing, really trying to make sure that data is up to date and matching IRS records. Organizations that arrive at filing season with cleaner data are going to have a much better experience, much lower error rates, and organizations that wait until submission are going to discover problems when there's very little time left to fix them.
Yeah, I think the key point to take away from this conversation is that IRS doesn't create these data problems, these data quality issues, right? IRS is simply exposing data quality problems that you already have in your data. And because it's validating in real time, you now have to address those problems much earlier in the process than you used to.
Yeah, and that's really why solutions like TINCheck matter. They help organizations validate names and TINs upstream before the data reaches the filing process, really helping to reduce the risk of mismatches, B notices, backup withholding, penalty exposure. Really helps teams move into Iris with more confidence instead of finding out during submission that their data is not ready. All right, let's talk a little bit about building the right operating model for your organization around Iris. The question for organizations is not whether they will use Iris, right? Starting in 2027, Iris is the mandatory federal filing platform. Tax year 26 and beyond, this is our filing option. And there's no alternative path back to FIRE. The real question is how organizations are going to operate with Iris effectively and what they need to build around it for things like data quality, state compliance, automation, auditability, and then operational resilience.
And that urgency actually is already showing up with some of those new form types John mentioned early on when we were talking. There are some forms that are only available through Iris. You cannot file them through FIRE. And that includes some of the new One Big Beautiful Bill Act forms, like the Form 1098 VLI for vehicle loan interest deduction, the Form 1099 LPS for long-term payments, and the Form 5498 for Trump accounts contributions, in addition to the 1099 DA for digital assets. So organizations that have obligations under some of those new forms, they definitely need an Iris-capable process in place, regardless of their current filing volume. So even organizations that have been deferring their Iris readiness no longer have an option to wait.
Yeah, Form 1099 DA is a really important example. It's for digital asset reporting. It was new for tax year 25 filing season, and it's also accepted only through Iris. Made it a very high visibility example of why Iris capability can't be deferred going forward. This form impacted a lot of financial institutions and crypto exchanges. Because it's a first-year form, organizations have to manage the XML schema complexity and the state-by-state variations. So many states are still using 1220 guidance as their primary filing reference, but there is no Form 1099 DA in the 1220 guidance. So filers are dealing with Iris XML at the federal level and then different legacy or state-specific expectations at the state level.
Yeah, and I think the 1099 DA is a great example at the state level, because what we found for 2025 is, since they were not ready and they were still relying on that legacy format, many of them reverted back to the oldest form of submission, paper, wanting us to send millions and millions of 1099s via mail or, via PDF uploads to their website. So again, really important that you are really prepared for multiple formats at the state level as we go through a few years of this transition. I mean, again, Iris is your federal filing platform, but Iris doesn't handle the state distribution in the way that many organizations have relied on historically. I think most organizations that file in multiple states, they're going to need a process that can generate the Iris XML for federal files. They're going to need the legacy 1220 format, or even some state-specific formats for state filing. And ideally, both of those formats need to come from a single upstream workflow of transactions. So, without that, your teams are going to end up managing duplicate processes, duplicate data transformations, and certainly more opportunity for error in the reporting process. State filing automation, I think, is probably going to be one of the most tricky parts of the Iris implementation.
Yeah, this is also where organizations really need to be realistic about the cost and complexity of building Iris capabilities internally. The build path can expand really quickly. One large financial institution had a project plan for a 12-month build that they believed was going to cost them about $1.5 million. That effort expanded to a 22-month build and more than $3 million. The team also doubled in size from 4 engineers to 8 over that time period. So, and that was before producing a finished project or product, and really focused only on the federal Iris side, not considering all of the state-specific implications coming out of that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even after the implementation, organizations are going to have to account for the ongoing change, right? Right. Annual schema updates, new form types, the fresh certification cycles, form by form testing, of course, the state filing changes, and then those correction workflows that we were talking about. So the build decision versus, an outsourced decision, building definitely creates permanent tech debt internally. And so organizations really do need to understand that before they assume they can just absorb the iris build internally.
Yeah, purpose built solutions can help reduce the burden a bit. The goal is not to avoid iris. The goal is to operate iris much more effectively, and that means having systems and workflows that support federal iris filing, state filing requirements, tin and name validation, correction management, audit trails and reporting, and then handling all of the ongoing regulatory changes.
Yep. And that's where solutions like our eFile My Forms, 1099 Pro, and TINCheck can fit into your broader strategy, because those solutions help organizations build the processes around iris that iris itself does not provide. And for some organizations, the need is just simpler filing support. But for others, it's an enterprise scale workflow integration and compliance management. For nearly everyone, though, data quality and TIN validation become more important as real-time IRS validation of the data is now becoming the standard.
Yeah, the key message is really that iris is mandatory, but iris alone is not a complete operating model. Organizations really need to decide how they're going to support the full compliance lifecycle around it. And that includes the data before filing, the federal and state workflows during filing, and the correction and audit processes after filing.
Yeah. Future proofing, and well, I think we'll wrap up with kind of future proofing. You're talking about how to do that for your 1099 process. And I would say it's not just about getting through this coming season with the sunset, because the move from Fire to Iris is part of a broader IRS modernization strategy that is planned to eventually impact Affordable Care Act reporting, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act reporting. So yes, the IRS is looking to take down the AIR system for ACA returns, the IDE system where we file FATCA, and for all information reporting to run through the IRIS platform. So organizations that have obligations across, multiple regimes and form types really need to be thinking beyond the current 1099 workflow. You're going to need infrastructure and vendor relationships that can really adapt as the IRS and the states continue to consolidate and modernize their information reporting systems and processes.
Yeah, this compliance environment is definitely going to keep changing. We're looking ahead already to the 2027 filing cycle. Organizations should definitely be prepared for some moving pieces. The IRS guidance on corrections for original filings still hasn't been released. So for filings made in Fire, that is. So how you're going to correct anything next year that you previously filed in the Fire system. There's a lot of standardization conversations on furnishing electronic statements to recipients. There's additional regulatory changes expected in the 2027 filing cycle. There's more states adopting the 1099 DA and other formats, the IRIS formats at the state level. And then we expect to see some changes to the combined federal state filing program as well. So a reactive strategy is going to leave teams feeling a bit behind as they're trying to prepare for tax year 26 reporting.
So, as you're thinking about this, some of the questions that any organization should be asking internally, I think are probably much more operational right now. Are we validating TINs and names at the point of onboarding, or do we only validate, at filing season? Do we have a workflow to respond to these IRIS real-time error messages during the filing window? Can we produce both the IRIS XML and legacy state formats, from a single data source? Are we recertifying our IRIS connection annually for every single return type that we issue? So I think those are operational questions that companies need to be asking themselves.
Yeah, and that really gets to the heart of readiness. Future proofing means building a compliance process that's going to absorb change. The clean upstream data, the continuous TIN and name validation, automation where manual work creates risk, federal and state filing flexibility, the annual certification planning, and then ownership across tax, IT, security, operations. Those components are all really part of being ready for this change coming ahead.
Yeah. Organizations that are going to succeed are going to be the ones that treat this change and overall compliance as an ongoing operating model as opposed to a once a year task. I think, most organizations, do try to treat information reporting as a once a year task. And I just think with such an operating model shift here with this new system, you really need to make this more of an ongoing operating model shift. Not a one-time, IRIS implementation. I think that in order to keep pace with IRS modernization, state level change, and then just, new reporting obligations as they emerge, all you'll be doing is building processes, constantly building tech and processes to keep pace. So really need to make sure that you treat this as an ongoing operating model change as opposed to something we're going to just deal with once a year.
Yeah, for teams evaluating their next step, Sovos can help assess your IRIS readiness, strengthen your TIN and name validation, support a much more scalable information reporting strategy.
If you're still assessing how your organization is for the move, how ready you are for the move from FIRE to IRIS, now is the time to take a closer look. Visit the link, which is also appearing on the banner below us on the screen, the promo.sovos.com FIRE to IRIS link. It will connect you with a Sovos IRIS expert and give you some practical guidance on your risk exposure and timeline and filing footprint and next steps for a more confident transition.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a good one.